Blood has recently and very quickly turned into one of my favorite FPS games of all time. In fact, one of my favorite games in general. It's just genuinely satisfying to play, being easy to pick up but difficult to master. You can blast enemies in all kinds of ways, but if you aren't careful, the same thing can just as easily happen to you. And that delightful gameplay is part of an absolutely entrancing world, with its gothic horror setting, featuring many interesting concepts for enemies and levels, personality oozing out of every single crack in the wall. But where that shines through the most, aside from the enemies you battle, is in the game's weapons. Each of them being a vehicle for you to cause mass destruction, having a defined purpose that they, and only they, excel at. Which is something that can't really be said for the arsenals of other FPS games, not just at the time, but even in general. Too often do they follow the same basic structure of single shot weapon, faster shot weapon, spread shot weapon, explosive weapon, energy weapon, and experimental high damage weapon. It's a tried and tested formula, but one that ultimately leads to so many games simply blending together. While Blood is at times guilty of following the same pattern, it tries to at least put a spin on each of its weapons by adding little quirks and tweaks to them, making them not only fun to use, but also stand out against other weapons of the era. And I'd even go so far as to say that the entire arsenal is flawless in its execution, with only very few outliers that aren't completely convincing. That's why I'd like to analyze each and every single weapon in the game, to show you why they're not just good, but perfect. Both in terms of what they add to the gameplay, as well as what they add to the world that the game takes place in. I suppose it's remarkably similar to my One Perfect Enemy series in that regard. Oh, go watch this too! Anyhow, let's begin by taking a look at the less original units of the arsenal to show that even a common, potentially overdone idea can be turned into something enjoyable. The following weapons aren't bad per se, they're just not particularly unique in their role or design as a whole. Essentially, ones you can see in many other games. However, Blood almost refuses to let them stay in that hole. The only exception to this is definitely the pitchfork, the obligatory melee weapon in the game, and doing nothing to change that. It does pitiful damage and serves no point other than stabbing weaker enemies when you're out of ammo. Duke Nukem 3D at the very least allowed you to use its mighty foot on a whim, while Doom allowed you to go berserk using, well, berserk. In Blood, however, it's the only weapon that doesn't even have a secondary attack. I think it'd have been possible for Caleb to throw it on alt fire, making it pierce any enemies it travels through, similar to the axe from Hedon. At the very least, it has a charismatic design, fitting well into the Frankenstein-esque angry townsfolk mob vibe that the game is going for. Equally obligatory is the game's Evil Dead-inspired shotgun. Its primary attack fires one barrel each, dealing overall not a lot of damage, but being fairly accurate at a distance. Together with the Akimbo power-up, it's rather reliable even late in the game. It is unfortunately overall a lot weaker than shotguns from other games though. However, its secondary fire is where it truly shines. Using both barrels simultaneously, it will absolutely delete common enemies such as cultists and zombies. In that regard, it's comparable to Doom 2's Super Shotgun, just for single enemies instead of multiple. It also almost ensures that zombies won't be getting up again after getting shot down, and is even effective against tougher enemies like hellhounds and gargoyles. My favorite aspect has to be the fact that it pushes enemies away when hit, which is absolutely hilarious when their corpse flies all the way across a chasm. The Tommy gun is also not overly original, but serves the purpose of chain guns like ones from Doom and Duke Nukem. The main attack is a reliable way of taking out multiple and tankier enemies, even from further away, and can also kill zombies permanently. The secondary attack of spraying the gun across the room is great for taking down larger groups, even firing twice as many bullets. The fact it makes you look like an action movie star as well is just the icing on the cake. The napalm launcher fills the role of the rocket launcher type weapon, so there's not much to add here. However, its shots set anything it doesn't kill outright on fire, potentially finishing them off later. The alternate fire though shoots out a ball of death that bounces across the room, causing minor explosions as it does. This attack is really useful for clearing out rooms full of enemies that would kill you instantly if they saw you. It's also just a cool effect, seeing the ball of napalm fly from left to right. And finally, the last of the less original weapons is the Tesla cannon. You obtain it later in the game, it shoots fast and does a lot of damage. What else is there to say? Well, its bolts also travel through enemies, making it another method of taking out groups, and it's also highly effective against stronger foes and even bosses. The secondary fire, a much larger lightning bolt, does essentially the same thing, just dealing even more damage. I honestly never used it that often, because the primary fire was fast and strong enough to simply spam at all kinds of enemies. While the idea of a Tesla gun is an old hat these days, with later games like the Wolfenstein series really capitalizing on it, it was rather novel for the time. All in all, even though none of those weapons were anything extraordinary compared to other FPS at the time, they at least have one other quality each to make them stand out against the rest. Some mechanics, like the spray and pray of the Tommy gun, haven't really been done again even these days. But let us now divert our attention to the actually original weapons in the arsenal.
Open for business.
Now we're on to the weapons that are truly unique to Blood, or at the very least, weren't as commonplace at the time, or even today. The first one is the flare gun, which is downright the single best starter pistol I have seen in any game to this day. Compared to games like Doom and Duke Nukem, it seems rather underpowered. While their pistols can easily dispatch weaker foes within seconds, the fact that the flare gun merely sets enemies on fire over time makes it appear almost quaint. However, pistols in those games don't scale very well with the difficulty of later levels, and are almost immediately replaced by higher damage or faster firing guns once you obtain them. They are called starter pistols for a reason, because you won't use them outside the first few levels. But in Blood, that issue is skipped entirely, because it doesn't even deal any damage. Enemies always combust at the same time when hit, no matter when or where they are. This makes it a remarkably effective weapon against basically all common enemies even late in the game, as well as against ones with lots of health like the butchers. Since it doesn't set enemies on fire instantly, it even adds a little bit of strategy, requiring you to stay alive or take cover until they eventually burst into flames. The secondary fire further cements the flare gun as a late game weapon, as it shoots out multiple flares at once that explode into flames on contact, essentially being a less powerful napalm launcher. This attack is very effective against many smaller enemies like rats, bats and hands, which are too hard to hit with regular weapons, or too close to risk using dynamite on them. The flare gun also leads to one of the best effects in the game, namely seeing enemies burn alive in front of you, flailing their arms around desperately while screaming their slowly scorching lungs out at the same time. It's the most over-the-top way of portraying death by fire that is just charming instead of horrifying. The dynamite is not quite as unique, as it also appeared in the game Outlaws by LucasArts. And yet it's probably the most workhorse weapon in the entire game, potentially even more than the shotgun, something that's completely unheard of in FPS games at the time. A shotgun not being the main weapon? Surely you jest. It's a rather self-explanatory weapon. You light the fuse, throw the damn thing, and anything it touches explodes. It's incredibly dangerous for basically every enemy in the game, again completely deleting lighter foes and pulverizing smaller ones, while slowly yet surely draining even the tankiest of foes of their HP. Since you've seen Civi's video, you know how much fun it is to jump around the level and chuck them at your pursuer's feet, but you can also throw them down holes or water to empty them out. It's just a really reliable form of damage, especially since you also get a lot of ammo for it. This is again astonishing, considering it also basically takes on the role of the rocket launcher type weapon for most shooters. However, the dynamite delivers unquestionably the most satisfying explosions out of any of them. Rocket launchers in games like Doom and Quake are pretty basic and straightforward, destroying enemies exactly how you'd imagine them to. It's the most middle of the road you can get. In Duke Nukem 3D, I often found explosive weapons more cumbersome than anything, either not damaging enemies that are right next to them, or leading to my own death, despite me keeping a good distance. But in Blood, every single explosion is a spectacle, shaking the screen while blasting your ears with loud kablams, tearing through anything in its path, launching enemies across the room or even into the goddamn sky, or while painting the walls red. It's like homemade fireworks, especially with the high-pitched cultist screams as every limb detaches from their bodies. The secondary attack is less instantaneous, merely letting the dynamite explode once the fuse runs out. It's useful for throwing it around corners where you suspect enemies might be lurking, but I usually found it more engaging to simply barge in and chuck them at everything that's moving. Still, the option is there if you need it. And it's not fair to slam it for not being as powerful when the main attack is already the most efficient way of taking enemies out in the game. What I find absolutely hilarious is that the dynamite will explode when the fuse runs out, whether it's on the ground or in your hands. That caught me off guard at least once in the game, and I have no one to blame except myself. However, the dynamite also sees itself get split into two different weapons, which take one of its aspects and expand on it. The first of which is the remotely detonated dynamite. It functions much like the secondary attack, with the difference being that you decide when it blows up. I only ever used it when I ran out of regular dynamite, but it's a very viable alternative, especially since you can potentially make it detonate even sooner as long as you spam the button enough. And even if it's not as good, I still find it much better than Duke 3D's pipe bombs, which honestly feel rather slow and underwhelming to me. Unlike the dynamite bundle, you can barely even charge them as well. The other type is the proximity mine. This one also basically functions like the secondary attack, merely exploding whenever anyone steps near it, including the player. I personally don't care much for mine weapons in games, since they're too situational, requiring enemies to wander into very specific areas, while you could just shoot them directly. Especially in a linear game, where moving forward means abandoning mines you've already set, they become very pointless. See also trip mines in Duke Nukem 3D and Half-Life. But here, they're not just confined to sticking to a wall, you can throw them anywhere you please. That's why I mostly use them to clear out areas where I already knew enemies were hiding or were gonna pass by. So it's another nice option to have. The spray can or aerosol can is also pretty straightforward. Its primary fire shoots out fire when the button is held down, which easily sets enemies ablaze. It's an acceptable method against cultists and zombies as well as tinier creatures, but I rarely used it that way. Instead, I mostly used its secondary attack, for which Caleb simply skips the middleman and sets the whole can on fire to throw it much like the dynamite. Unlike that one, however, it doesn't explode on impact, but simply sets everything and everyone in the area on fire. Essentially, it's a literally high-octane flare. This attack is immensely useful against groups due to the splash radius being rather big. It's also my preferred method of taking out butchers, since it ignores the large health pool. Spray cans with a lighter are always some of the coolest weapons in video games, since they're something you can easily recreate in real life, but shouldn't, even though you almost definitely have. Unfortunately, the voodoo doll is something exclusive to the world of fiction. It's a real shame, but at least in Blood, it makes up one of the most entertaining weapons to use. Fundamentally, it's a glorified hitscan weapon, affecting any enemy at any distance in an instant. Just stab the doll and they will suffer. I never used it much at all when I played the game for the first time, but on my second playthrough, I realized its true potential. While the primary attack might not be as immediately rewarding as, let's say, the shotgun, its secondary attack exceeds it. Somehow, by waving your hand over it, it drains all of an enemy's health, and while it doesn't do the same to bosses, it doesn't leave them with a lot of life afterwards. Anytime Chiok reappeared, and he does so too much, it was my weapon of choice. The voodoo doll has such a unique design for a weapon, something I haven't really seen done in any other game. And although they had no reason to do so, the developers even implemented custom animations for certain enemies when dying to it. Like the butchers, which have possibly the best death animation in the entire game. Another neat detail is how Caleb will accidentally stab himself with a needle if he's not pointing it at an enemy. It's not just cute, but it even damages you a little, making the doll a bit of a risk versus reward weapon. And speaking of draining all your health, this brings me to the last weapon in the game, the Life Leech. The primary attack functions basically how the BFG 9000 was initially conceived, by shooting out multiple balls of fire at once. I don't think it does nearly as much damage as it should, being more comparable to Doom's plasma rifle, which is unusual for such a late game weapon. For that reason, I had originally intended to place it into the unoriginal weapon category. However, its alternate attack saves it from falling into that pit, because the Life Leech is the only weapon in the game that allows you to place it back down, serving as an automatic turret, firing upon anything in range. This is the attack I used way more often, since I could simply plop it down into a room and come back later once all the enemies in it were dead. In fact, that's how I defeated the final boss. Sentry type weapons are always most interesting to me in video games, perhaps because I love tower defense games so much. It also kind of reminds me of Duke Nukem's Holo Duke, but actually useful. Aside from that, I couldn't possibly dislike it, simply because of how goofy the skull on top looks with one of its eyes still being in its socket. He just looks so happy to be here. The Life Leech also used to suck the life out of enemies and return it to you instead, hence the name, but now it merely drains your own health if you don't have the ammo for it. Much like the voodoo doll, it makes it a high risk versus reward weapon. But I'd gladly trade my own life for defensive power. As you can clearly tell, I have a lot of fondness for the arsenal in this game. And why wouldn't I? These are the most useful and unique weapons I've seen in any FPS, no video game period. In my experience, weapons in shooter games seem to follow one of two trends. The first option is that they are kinda bland but have a clear gameplay purpose, as is the case in its shooters like Doom and Quake. Wow, a shotgun and a rocket launcher? You spoil me! In this case, the intention is just giving the player tools with which to solve the problem of there being too many enemies in a room. where the focus is less on offering them something they've never seen before, but something they're familiar with. Basically, what every single quote-unquote boomer shooter does these days. The second option is that weapons are original, with less of an emphasis on being actually effective. Ones that add a lot of personality to the game, but are borderline gimmicky or outright useless. Think of how many of Duke Nukem 3D's and Half-Life's weapons fill the same role or have no purpose at all. Both of those options are fine in their own ways, of course, but they also mostly have the problem of certain weapons simply being superior to other ones, so you'd always want to use them instead, especially when it comes to starter weapons. In Blood, however, all weapons are both unique and useful, with the exception of the pitchfork. Granted, not everyone is exclusive to that game like the shotgun and dynamite, but they're tweaked enough to feel different. At best, they are among the most original and enjoyable concepts in any game, fitting the setting and characters perfectly. At worst, they're basic, yet reliable. And none of them are truly superior in every situation, since each has their own up and downsides. This is further helped by being limited to certain ammo types, some being rarer than others. I really think that those so-called boomer shooters of today could really take some notes from Blood. Too many of them seem to basically just copy Doom and Quake for the 100th time and leave it at that. It's still a shotgun, even if you call it a shrapnel cannon or frag fire gun. I know that they do this because these are tried and tested weapon concepts that are just fun. But you know what else is fun? Throwing dynamite everywhere, setting enemies on fire with flare guns, or using cursed voodoo dolls on them. And all of those were only possible because Blood tried to innovate. They risked something and it paid off, and as a result, it stands out amongst the reign of other FPS games, even to this day. So the moral is that you should always try to broaden your horizon and not stay confined to your little comfort zone. It's not guaranteed to be successful if you do, but it's worth a shot. Or, at the very least, please add weapons other than shotguns and rocket launchers to your games, I beg you. Anyway, what's your take on this? Do you know of any games with an arsenal like Blood's that are equally engaging? I can think of a few. So do let me know down below. And please consider liking, subscribing, and perhaps even supporting me on Patreon. Anything is appreciated. But for now, thank you very much for watching, have a wonderful day, and goodbye. Das war meine Identität. Oh, das war Postbote. Postbote.